Hey guys,
whose mother was
tonight we are going to
deposed,
dive deep into the
and
true
whose
story of
father
a king
was assassinated.
whose life was full of thrilling and drastic events. Just imagine, a
Grew
child
up
born in a
under the
besieged
control
castle,
of brutal
whose mother
political
was
regents.
deposed, and whose father was assassinated by gunpowder and possibly strangulation. The boy grew up under the control of a series of brutal political regents, witnessing bloodshed and betrayal as the daily rule of the game. That is James I of England,
the first monarch to unite
the two crowns of England and Scotland. His reign was not merely a smooth transition of power. James I was dubbed the wisest fool in Christendom due to his astonishing erudition. He wrote books on everything from theology to the art of absolute rule, and even how to detect witches.
To the art of
but at the same time,
rule.
he was the center of raging court
But at
dramas.
the same time,
We will
he was the
explore his
centre of
blatant
raging
favoritism
court
towards young
dramas.
male paramours, which incited constant resentment and hostility. We will witness how he had to confront the infamous gunpowder plot, a horrifying attempt to blow up the entire parliament along with him and his
Do
family,
not worry about
and how
the
he made
others,
great
my dear.
contributions such as
They mean
patronizing the
nothing
creation of the
compared
famous
to you.
king, James Bible. He transitioned from the unstable King of Scotland to the powerful King of England. But the price he paid was religious division and the seeds of discord that would later lead to a devastating civil war. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely
Patronising the
enjoy what I do
creation
here.
of the famous
And as
King
usual,
James Bible.
let me know where you are relaxing and what your current local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. James Stewart was born on the 19th of June,
The price he
1566,
paid was religious
within the
division
thick stone walls of
and the
Edinburgh
seeds
Castle.
of discord.
Outside, the wind of the Scottish hills howled around the ramparts. Inside, a tiny prince drew his first breath in a world already plotting over his name. From that very first moment, James lay at the centre of a storm he could not see. His father, Henry Stuart, known as Lord Darnley, and his mother, Mary Stuart, the woman history remembers as Mary, Queen of Scots, both carried Tudor blood in their veins. That meant both of them, in different ways, had a path that could lead to the throne of England. The child in the cradle, without knowing it, was a living claim. Yet the marriage that created him was less a love story and more a fuse laid across a field of gunpowder. By the time James was old enough to form memories, that fuse had already burned almost to the end. To understand why, and to understand why his birth mattered so much,
This alliance
we have to
secures
drift
the Tudor
slowly
line and
backward,
brings peace
like
to the
walking down a
realm,
long
Grace.
candlelit corridor
I
of
pray it holds
portraits,
firm, my
until we reach the face of Henry VII, the first Tudor king. Henry VII and his queen, Elizabeth of York, stitched together two rival houses, Lancaster and York, and with them, they built the fragile peace that ended the Wars of the Roses. They had several children who survived to adulthood. Arthur, the elder son who died before he could wear the crown. Margaret, the poised and politically valuable daughter. Henry, who would later become Henry VIII, and Mary, who would one day briefly be Queen of France. From these branches, alliances stretched out across Europe, like roots seeking new soil.
Could you betray me
It
like
was
this?
Margaret
You
Tudor,
undermine my authority
not
at
her
every
more
turn.
famous
Your
brother
authority
Henry
is a
VIII,
joke, Mary.
who
The
quietly
council
became
knows
the
who
bridge
true
between
ruler is.
England and Scotland.
I have heard
She was
tales
married
of
off
your
to James
grace's
IV of
beauty,
Scotland,
but they pale
sealing
in
a hope
comparison
that
to
the
the
two
reality.
kingdoms might one day be
You
bound by
illuminate
blood
this hall.
instead of steel.
How dare you
Their
negotiate
son,
behind my
James
back?
V
You
of
have no
Scotland,
authority here.
would be the
Tell
father
your
of
queen
Mary,
that I am the
Queen
king,
of Scots.
and I will not
Through
be
another
defied.
marriage, Margaret
I will
produced a
not be
daughter,
trifled with.
Margaret
I
Douglas,
demand the
who would
dukedom of
become
Albany and
grandmother
the
to Lord
crown
Darnley.
matrimonial. You
So
will
both
address
Mary
me
and
as your
Darnley were
king,
grandchildren
or
of
face the
Margaret Tudor,
consequences.
but
You
through
will
different
not defy me in
marriages.
front of the council,
One line
Monsieur
stayed
Marquis.
proudly
I am
Scottish
your
on the
queen,
throne
not
of
a
Holyrood.
subject to be
The other
silenced.
remained just
I will
close
not
enough to
stand
England
for
to be
this.
dangerous.
Down
When Mary
with the
and Darnley
villain.
married, it was as though two
In
separate
the Queen's
paths to the
presence.
English throne wrapped
Stop
around
this
each other
violence.
and tied themselves into a knot. And inside
Madame,
that knot,
save me.
one quiet
Justice,
June
Madame,
evening,
I am
James was
slain.
born.
Away,
But the
leave him
household that
alone.
welcomed him was poisoned from within. The marriage between Mary and Darnley soured with startling speed. At first, he was charming, handsome, and flattering. Soon, however, another picture emerged. A man quick to anger, given to drink, consumed by jealousy, and clumsy in politics. He insulted powerful Scottish nobles, demanded titles he had not earned, and sulked when he was denied the crown matrimonial, the right to rule alongside Mary as an equal king. The palace rooms that should have been filled with lullabies became instead a place of whispered
Sign
arguments
the
and
act of
slammed
abdication
doors.
or face
The
the
tension broke in a burst of
How dare
violence
you
that
challenge
shocked
your
all of
anointed-
Europe. Mary's Italian secretary, David Rizzio, was dragged from her presence and murdered in front of witnesses, stabbed again and again while the pregnant queen
We
screamed.
proclaim James
Darnley
the
was
Sixth,
deeply implicated
our
in the plot.
undoubted sovereign
The stain of
lord,
that night
king
never
of
washed
this
off.
realm.
He had hoped
Long
that by
live the
eliminating a man he suspected of too much influence over his wife, he would gain power. Instead, he became isolated, distrusted by Mary, and despised by many nobles. What followed felt less like a royal
sanctuary
marriage
is
and more
here
like
now.
a slow-moving tragedy. Darnley fell ill and was housed at a place called Kirk-a-Field, a quiet residence near Edinburgh. There, in the dark hours of a February night in 1567, the building was shattered by a tremendous explosion that woke the city. But when Darnley's body was found in the garden, he did not look like a man killed by fire or falling stone. There were no fatal burns, no
You are
crushed
amongst
limbs,
friends here, James.
only signs that suggested
But
he
you
had been
must heed
strangled
my
after
words
the blast.
closely if you are to
Rumours
remain
spread
safe.
as easily as smoke.
As
Many in
Livy
Scotland
explains,
whispered
the
that this
strength
had
of
not
Rome
been an
was not
accident,
built in a day.
nor an attack by
Do you
faceless
grasp the
enemies,
significance of this?
but a
Yes, sir,
carefully
but what of
arranged
the
murder.
Macedonians who
Suspicion settled heavily on Mary herself, and on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the powerful nobleman who very soon afterward would become her third husband. To many, the timing spoke louder than any denial. The nobles of Scotland, already restless and used to bloodshed, moved against their queen.
Quickly, help him!
They claimed to be protecting the kingdom, to be avenging Darnley, to be defending the true line of succession. Under pressure,
Heavens, what
Mary
is
was
happening
forced to
Lord
abdicate the
Erskine?
throne.
He's been poisoned.
The crown
with
that
the
had once
goblet.
weighed on the head of a young
Someone
woman
fetch a
now
physician
slipped onto the
immediately.
curls of her infant son. James, barely 1 year old, was proclaimed James the Sixth of Scotland, too young to walk, already a king. His mother, cornered and desperate, fled south into England, seeking protection from Elizabeth I.
The king's
Instead of
interference in
sanctuary,
the Kirk is an
she found
affront to God
captivity.
himself. We will not
Elizabeth,
be governed by
who had never
bishops.
named an heir and
must
guarded her
defend the
crown like a
covenant by
wounded
God.
animal guards
Your
its
Majesty,
last scrap
it
of
is an
food,
honour to finally
chose
meet
to
you.
keep Mary a
I
prisoner
trust
for
my
almost
journey
2
was worth the
decades,
trouble.
and
Welcome,
eventually
cousin.
signed the
I am
warrant for
eager
her
to know you.
execution.
Your
So
Majesty
the little boy at
possesses a wit
Edinburgh
far
Castle,
sharper than any
born under
blade in
banners and
Scotland.
cannon fire,
And you, Esme, a
grew up
tongue
without a
smoother
father,
than the finest French
without a
silk.
mother, and without any real safety. His earliest world was one of stone walls, suspicious guardians, and the restless knowledge that people had already
Look at
killed
the
and
silks
died
and
over
the
the blood in
feathers.
his veins.
A Frenchman
After Mary
sent
was
to
forced to
corrupt the
abdicate,
king.
the
We
little
must
king was
denounce
taken to
this
Stirling
impiety.
Castle, a fortress perched
By
on
my
volcanic
royal
rock,
decree, Esme,
thick-walled,
I
and
name
almost
you
impossible to
Duke
breach.
of the Whisperwood.
It became his cradle,
lands
his
are
classroom,
yours.
and his cage.
Who is
Though he
that
bore the
woman
title
in
of
the red
monarch,
gown?
James had no true
She looks
authority.
terribly out
He
of
was a
place.
symbol, a prize, and whoever held
He rides
custody of him
south tomorrow.
controlled Scotland.
We must act now
This
if the
reality
Kirk is to
shaped his
survive.
childhood more
Consider it
deeply
done,
than
Master
affection
Campbell.
ever could.
We are agreed.
Instead of a warm household or steady guidance, he grew up inside a maze of rivalries, betrayals, and bloodshed, where the sound of steel was more familiar than a mother's
By
voice.
this act, I am
James was placed
supreme
under the
governor
care of
over all.
Annabella Murray,
To deny this
Lady
is
Mar,
treason.
whose family had long been loyal
This is
custodians of
tyranny,
Stirling.
sire.
Under her supervision, the boy king was surrounded by attendants, nurses, and servants, but all were tightly monitored. The Queen's household had been dissolved. Nothing of Mary remained except whispers. One report from these early years notes that a drunken servant once injured James's leg, an incident many later believed contributed to the lifelong weakness in his gait. Even as a toddler, his body carried the marks of carelessness and neglect. By the age of 4, James began receiving instruction from male tutors, the most formidable of whom was George Buchanan. Buchanan was a brilliant Renaissance scholar, a poet, and one of the sharpest minds in Scotland. But he was also severe,
They say the Earl is
rigid,
planning something
and
treasonous.
convinced that discipline
If the
could
king
shape a
finds
king
out,
better
we are
than affection.
all doomed.
He beat James often, believing the young sovereign needed to learn
Guard
that
this
even
with your
monarchs
life,
were
John.
subject to the law.
The scroll must reach the
The
king.
boy,
Ride
frightened
like the
and
wind.
impressionable,
This message is
internalized
for the
every
king's
blow.
eyes only.
Buchanan also forced
This
James
feast
to
is
read pamphlets
bountiful, my
condemning
lord,
Mary,
but I find my
calling her
appetite for
immoral,
resolution
unfit,
stronger.
and
Indeed,
tyrannical.
Your Majesty.
Imagine
We
a
shall address
child
it
barely
directly.
tall enough to reach a writing desk being taught that his own mother deserved to fall from power. These lessons carved a strange contradiction into James's character. He would long desperately for loyalty and love, yet fear them both, convinced that trust was a doorway to treachery. Outside the nursery, Scotland tore itself apart.
By decree
In the
of His
first
Majesty
fragile
James
years
the
of
Sixth,
James's life, no fewer than 4 regents
Let
the
this
men meant to
accord
guide
settle
and
the
protect
matter
him
between the
died
Kirk
violently.
and the crown.
The first, James
Your
Stuart,
acknowledgement
Earl
secures
of
the
Moray,
peace of the realm.
was assassinated in 1570, the first recorded killing by firearm of a political leader in Europe. The second, Matthew Stuart, Earl of Lennox and James's own grandfather, was mortally wounded by gunfire in 1571. The little king, then only 5 years old, saw the chaos firsthand. The third regent, John Erskine, Earl of Mar, died suddenly in 1572, with rumours murmuring of poison. The final regent, James Douglas, Earl of Morton, lasted the longest, but he too would fall executed in 1575 for involvement in the murder of Lord Darnley. Thus, every man who attempted to rule Scotland on James's behalf met a violent end. In the history of European monarchies, it is difficult to find another childhood overshadowed by such a relentless procession of bloodshed. These were not isolated tragedies. Scotland itself was unstable, burning with the tension between noble factions, between Catholic and Protestant interests, between those loyal to Mary and those who wanted her eradicated. Stirling Castle, though fortified, was attacked more than once. Presbyterian lords, hostile to monarchical power, railed against the crown. Armed bands clashed across the countryside, and several plots aimed to kidnap James not to harm him, but to use him. A boy king could legitimize any cause, any rebellion, any claim. He was as valuable as he was vulnerable. Living in this atmosphere, James inhabited multiple roles at once, none of them chosen. He was the crowned sovereign of Scotland, expected to embody stability and continuity. Yet he was also a hostage of political circumstance, guarded more for his usefulness than for his safety. And he was a bargaining chip, the child whose very existence could tilt alliances and shape wars. Growing up in this world taught James a single, haunting lesson. Power was not merely desirable, it was necessary for survival. If he could not rule, he would be ruled. If he could not control, he would be controlled. Thus, in the dim chambers of Stirling Castle, a belief took root deep inside him as natural as breath. Only absolute authority could protect him from the chaos that had devoured every adult meant to guide him. And so the boy king watched and listened, storing away every moment of fear, every betrayal, every shifting loyalty. In the stillness of Stirling's stone halls, he began to imagine a future in which he would never again be a pawn. At the age of 13, James encountered a man who would alter the landscape of his emotions, his politics, and his understanding of power. Esme Stuart, a Scottish nobleman raised in France, graceful, charming, and 24 years older than the young king. When Esme arrived in Scotland in the year 1579, he entered not just the royal court but the hollow spaces of James's lonely childhood. In a world that had offered the boy king more discipline than affection, more suspicion than tenderness, Esme appeared almost like a figure from another life, warm, attentive, elegant, and entirely devoted to him. From the first moment they met, James was transfixed. He followed Esme with his eyes, sought his company, and clung to his presence as though he had finally discovered something he had been denied since infancy. The chroniclers of the time, both sympathetic and hostile, noted the transformation. James, usually stiff and anxious around others, softened visibly in Esme's company. He embraced him openly before the court, held his hand, leaned on him while walking, and was even said to have kissed him in public. In the late 16th century, physical closeness between men was not inherently scandalous. Gestures of friendship were common. Yet the intensity between James and Esme surpassed the boundaries of ordinary affection. Many historians believe James formed deep emotional attachments and perhaps romantic ones to handsome, refined men throughout his life. Esme Stuart was the first, followed years later by Robert Carr and George Villiers. But to James, lonely and starved of gentleness, Esme was not merely a favourite. He was a lifeline. Esme's arrival did not go unnoticed by the leaders of the Scottish Kirk. They looked at him and saw danger from every direction. He was French, a nation long associated with Catholic influence. He had once been Catholic himself before nominally converting to Protestantism, and worst of all, they feared that Esme intended to reconnect James with his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, still imprisoned in England. The idea of Mary returning to power or even gaining influence sent shockwaves through a country already fractured by religious suspicion. James, however, was unmoved by the warnings. He trusted Esme blindly. He showered him with titles and lands, first elevating him to Earl of Lennox and soon after to Duke of Lennox, one of the highest honours in Scotland. The young king allowed him control not only of political matters, but also of the royal household, including the king's private chambers. To the nobles, this was intolerable. In their eyes, Esme was not simply a foreigner. He was an interloper with the king's ear, the king's confidence, and perhaps the king's heart. The most dramatic shift came with the fall of Regent Morton. James Douglas, Earl of Morton, had long dominated Scottish politics and had been the last surviving regent of James's minority. But Esme, recognizing that Morton's power blocked his own influence, manoeuvred carefully. In 1581, Morton was arrested, charged with involvement in the murder of Lord Darnley. He was convicted and executed using the Maiden, a Scottish precursor to the guillotine. As Morton's head fell, James experienced something he had never felt before: the tremor of genuine, personal power. For the first time, he was not the pawn in someone else's struggle. He had acted, or believed he had acted, as a king. The execution marked a turning point. James began to see monarchy not as a burden he carried for others, but as an authority meant to be absolute. But the glow of that moment faded quickly. Scotland's noble and Presbyterian factions, alarmed by Esme's influence, conspired against him. Their fear was not only that the king loved Esme too much, but that Esme was leading James away from the strict Protestant path that the Kirk demanded. In the autumn of 1582, a group of nobles launched a daring political coup known as the Raid of Ruthven. James, then 16 years old, was seized while visiting Ruthven Castle. The conspirators confronted him with stern faces and armed men, insisting that Esme's influence was corrupting him and endangering Scotland. The young king pleaded, protested, and tried to escape, but it was futile. For nearly 1 year, he was held under what was effectively house arrest, a horrifying reminder that his crown did not guarantee his safety. Esme, unable to protect James, was forced into exile. He left Scotland heartbroken, sailing back toward France with the knowledge that he would never again see the boy he cherished. Within a year, in 1583, he died far from the court where he had risen so quickly, far from the king who adored him. His embalmed heart was sent back to James in a small silver casket. Upon receiving it, the teenage king broke down in tears, weeping openly as though his childhood had died with Esme. In a way, it had. Through that grief, James absorbed a lesson that would echo through the rest of his life. In Scotland, affection could be a crime, loyalty could be fatal, and love, whatever form it took, could be crushed by the cold machinery of politics. After escaping the control of the Ruthven raiders, James entered his 18th year with a lesson carved painfully into his bones. If he did not hold power tightly, someone else would seize it from his hands. The months of captivity had taught him that crowns were fragile things, easily taken, easily manipulated, and never truly secure unless wrapped in authority. So, in the year 1584, James struck back with a set of laws that echoed like thunder across Scotland, the so-called Black Acts. These statutes declared, without hesitation or apology, that the king and not the Presbyterian Kirk was the supreme authority in the Scottish Church. Ministers who had previously spoken as if they were judges over monarchs were forced to accept that they were subjects first and clergy second. For James, this was not merely a legal adjustment, it was a declaration of identity. He would never again be the frightened child of Stirling Castle, shuffled from regent to regent. He would rule with a steadiness that could not be overpowered. The seeds of absolutism, the political philosophy he would later bring to England in the year 1603, were planted here, in the shadow of fear and humiliation. Yet even as James tightened his grip on Scotland, he loosened his ties with the woman who had given him life. Mary, Queen of Scots, imprisoned in England, wrote letters filled with longing, strategy, and desperation. She proposed co-rule, insisted she could be useful, reminded him of their shared blood. But James, who had never known her embrace, her voice, or her guidance, responded with cold calculation. He understood that supporting Mary could jeopardize his future claim to the English throne. Elizabeth I had no children and no named heir. If James wished to inherit peaceably, he could not risk appearing disloyal to the English Queen. When Mary was discovered to be entangled in the Babington plot, an elaborate plan to assassinate Elizabeth James sent a protest letter, but even his courtiers remarked that it lacked fire. It was written more from duty than grief. In the year 1587, Mary was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle, and the world waited to see how her son would mourn. Some said James wept bitterly when the news reached him. Others claimed he showed barely a tremor. But regardless of the truth, one fact became undeniable. With Mary gone, the path to the English succession was clearer than ever. At home, however, Scotland was far from calm. James faced recurring challenges, chief among them George Gordon, the Earl of Huntly. Huntly was clever, ambitious, and embedded in a web of Catholic alliances that stretched beyond Scotland's borders. He was implicated in correspondence with Spain, in violent local feuds, and in the Spanish Blanks plot, a mysterious agreement that potentially invited Spanish intervention in Scotland. By all logic, Huntly should have been crushed. And yet James spared him again and again. This was not affection. It was strategy. James understood the value of balance. If Huntly were destroyed, the Presbyterian nobles would become too powerful. If the Presbyterians dominated, they could challenge the crown. So James kept his enemies alive, not because he trusted them, but because they distrusted each other. As long as no single faction felt secure, James could remain the point around which they revolved. It was a delicate kind of monarchy, born from a lifetime of being cornered, but it worked. In the midst of this political turbulence, James made a choice that would shape both his personal life and the future of his dynasty. He sought a bride. He needed legitimacy, stability, and heirs signs that Scotland's future, and possibly England's, would run through him. Negotiations pointed toward Denmark, and in the year 1589, James married Anne of Denmark. The marriage began with adventure. Storms at sea delayed Anne's arrival, prompting James to sail out himself to retrieve her, a rare gesture for a king. Their union would later face strained differences in temperament, household conflicts, religious disputes, but the marriage achieved what it needed to. Anne bore James several children, and 3 survived to adulthood. Henry Frederick, born in the year 1594, Elizabeth, born in the year 1596, and Charles, born in the year 1600. Their births secured James's dynasty and signalled to Europe that Scotland had a stable, legitimate royal house. Through these years, James governed with cautious firmness. He tried to quiet feuds, to bring rebellious nobles into line, to appease the Kirk without surrendering to it. Yet behind every decree, every negotiation, every sleepless night, lay a deeper longing, one that had followed him since childhood. His eyes were always turned southward, toward England, toward the throne that had eluded so many, toward the crown that Mary had lost and Elizabeth still guarded. James had survived assassins, kidnappers, regents, coups, and heartbreak. Now, with adulthood settling around him and heirs at his side, he believed that destiny at last might be within reach. In the year 1600, Scotland trembled beneath the weight of a mystery that remains unsolved to this day: the Gowrie plot. It began with an invitation polite, noble, and utterly ordinary on the surface. The Ruthven brothers, Alexander and John, sons of the very Earl who had once imprisoned James during the raid of Ruthven in the year 1582, sent word that they possessed a secret treasure in Perth. It was the sort of lure designed to stir royal curiosity, and James, who had always been receptive to intrigue, agreed to visit. When the king arrived at Gowrie House on that August day, nothing seemed amiss. He dined, conversed, and allowed himself to be led by the younger brother, Alexander, through a series of increasingly isolated rooms. Then, inside a small chamber locked behind them, the mood shifted. Alexander Ruthven closed the door, turned on James, and drew a dagger. He accused the king of murdering their father years before, and proclaimed he would now take justice into his own hands. James, weakened by a lifelong infirmity in his legs, struggled. How he escaped remains a point of debate even now. But the story he later repeated was simple. He wrenched free just enough to reach the window and cry out one desperate word: treason. His attendants rushed up the stairwell. A violent struggle broke out. Alexander Ruthven was killed, followed swiftly by his brother John, the Earl of Gowrie, who arrived too late to save him. Within hours, the king's loyalists had taken control of the estate. The Ruthvens were declared traitors, their names struck from the rolls, their property seized by the crown. Yet Scotland murmured. James's tale, though dramatic, seemed strange in its details. Why would the Ruthvens invite the king to their own home, ensuring immediate blame? How could James, famously unathletic, unable to walk long distances unassisted, overpower a young and healthy nobleman in a locked room? And who was the mysterious man in the chamber, the witness James described, who apparently vanished without trace? No answers came. No investigation soothed the doubts. The Ruthvens were dead, the king survived, and the official account remained sealed by royal authority. Whether the plot was genuine revenge, political miscalculation, or a carefully constructed pretext, only one truth mattered. James emerged stronger. The Scottish Kirk, which had long questioned him, was forced begrudgingly to acknowledge the king's version of events. For the first time in years, James stood firmly above his critics, not beside them. The Gowrie plot became another stone laid on the path toward the authority he craved. And with Scotland now bending, however reluctantly under his will, James turned his gaze southward toward the dream that had lived inside him since childhood, toward England. Elizabeth I was aging. She had no children, no designated heir, and the Tudor line was thinning like frost on a winter window. The greatest threat to James's claim was Arbella Stuart, another descendant of Henry VII. Her supporters whispered of her Tudor bloodline, her English birth, her suitability, but James had something greater: patience and strategy. He understood that securing England required allies inside England itself, and so he sought out the most crucial figure in Elizabeth's government, Robert Cecil. Son of William Cecil, and the central mind behind Elizabeth's later reign, Robert Cecil was a man who understood power the way a mathematician understands numbers. Silently, sharply, and with absolute clarity, James courted him not with flattery, but with promises, stability, continuity, and a peaceful succession. Cecil, weary of uncertainty, agreed. Their correspondence grew into a secret pact. Cecil would prepare England, James would wait quietly, and when the moment came, there would be no civil war, no rival claimant, no blood spilled for the crown. That moment arrived in the early hours of the 24th day of March, in the year 1603. Elizabeth Tudor, the last of her line, breathed her final breath at Richmond Palace. As dawn touched the roofs of London, riders galloped through the city announcing the news. James VI of Scotland was now James I of England, and England did not resist. No swords were raised, no armies marched, no streets ran red. It was one of the smoothest royal transitions in English history, a rare miracle in a century, defined by religious terror and political upheaval. Thus the boy who had once lived as a hostage, the youth shaped by assassination and suspicion, the king forged in instability, crossed the border not as prey, not as pawn, but as sovereign. James Stuart, child of chaos, became the ruler of two kingdoms and the architect of what would one day become Great Britain. When Elizabeth I breathed her last on the 24th day of March in the year 1603, the proclamation of her successor happened with remarkable speed. James, long anticipated as the only logical heir, was declared King of England almost instantly. Yet the journey he made toward London was not the triumphant gallop many imagined, not a dazzling entry meant to eclipse the memory of the Virgin Queen. Instead, it was quiet, measured, almost contemplative. James moved slowly, as if reluctant to appear before a people who were still grieving, still adjusting, still whispering Elizabeth's name with a reverent kind of melancholy. From the Scottish border he travelled through Berwick, then York, then Burghley. Each town lit fires that glowed like small suns in the night. Bonfires, fireworks, triumphal arches, the people celebrated him with relief as much as with loyalty. For years England had lived under the shadow of uncertainty, unsure whether the kingdom would fall into civil conflict when Elizabeth died childless. Now that fear had dissolved, James was the promise of continuity, a living thread between two crowns long divided. But even in celebration, comparisons began. Elizabeth, with her golden speeches and sharp theatricality, had always known how to enchant a crowd. She stood before her people like an actress, bathed in candlelight, warm, witty, magnetic. James was the opposite. He did not enjoy being pressed by throngs of hands or showered with public adoration. His face often tightened in discomfort, not shining with delight, but shadowed by irritation. The English noted it. The whisper spread. Their new king lacked the charm of their old queen. And though few said it aloud, the disappointment hung quietly in the air like a drifting mist. Meanwhile, as James rode southward, his family unravelled in ways both painful and public. Prince Henry, the hope of Scotland, beloved by many, remained at Stirling Castle under the guardianship of the Mar family. Queen Anne seized the moment. She rushed to Stirling, demanding her son be released into her care at last. She had tried before and been denied, and when the Mars refused her again, anguish consumed her. Her fury escalated into a physical and emotional storm so intense that she suffered a miscarriage. The tragedy deepened the rifts already forming between husband and wife. A compromise emerged. Queen Anne and Prince Henry would travel to England together. Prince Charles, frail and frequently ill, was left behind in Scotland. Many believed he would not survive long enough to matter in the line of succession. Few could imagine that this quiet, trembling child would one day become Charles I, the king whose fate would fracture the kingdom entirely. When James reached London, he found the city stricken by plague. Death crept through the streets, forcing the royal household to scatter to safer regions. His coronation proceeded, but with muted splendour, no grand festivals, no swelling crowds, only the formal necessity of crowning a new monarch while illness stalked beyond the palace walls. England had a king, but it did not yet have the energy to celebrate him. Still, James showed an unexpected restraint. He did not purge the government. He did not sweep away Elizabeth's trusted advisers. Instead, he kept nearly all members of her Privy Council, including the indispensable Robert Cecil, the architect who had silently paved James's path to the throne. It was a calculated choice, and a wise one, signalling to England that the machinery of governance would not be shaken simply because a new dynasty now reigned. Yet beneath the calm surface, resentment brewed. The men closest to James, those permitted into his bedchamber, those who dined with him, those who travelled with him, were overwhelmingly Scottish. English nobles, proud and suspicious, bristled at the sight of unfamiliar faces surrounding their king. They saw the northern accents, the different customs, the unpolished manners, and felt overshadowed in their own kingdom. The seeds of indignation took root in whispers and glances long before they grew into political storms. And then, one habit of James quickly became impossible to ignore. He was utterly, helplessly devoted to hunting. The forests of England became his sanctuary. While matters of state accumulated on tables, James slipped into green woods with dogs and horses, losing himself in the chase. He believed truly that hunting preserved his health. He claimed the fresh air strengthened his body and kept melancholy at bay. But to the English court, this indulgence looked like negligence. Papers went unsigned. Meetings were cancelled. State matters languished while the king rode tirelessly through mud and thicket. Farmers began to complain that their fields were trampled. Courtiers muttered. Critics sharpened their quills. It was a small crack at first, but cracks, in time, have a way of widening, and as James settled into England slowly, awkwardly, with both triumph and unease, the first shadows of conflict were already gathering at the edge of his reign. In England, James clung to the belief that hunting kept him healthy, kept his lungs clear of London's foul air, kept his body from sinking into the excesses of palace feasting, kept his spirits steady through long days of governance. To him, a morning spent among trees and hounds was not laziness but medicine. Yet to those who watched him from council chambers and court corridors, the image appeared different. A king on horseback while documents stacked on his desk became less a picture of rustic balance and more a symbol of neglect. Farmers complained of trampled fields as the royal hunt swept across their land. Courtiers whispered that the king preferred stags to statecraft. And slowly, in taverns and in Parliament alike, criticism of James's governance began to merge with criticism of his hunts, as if the sound of hooves in the distance echoed the sound of authority slipping. Amidst this rising strain, another issue older, deeper, and far more volatile caught flame again: religion. Faith had shaped English history for generations, toppling monarchs, dividing families, and staining fields with blood. And now, once again, it stirred. Before James even set foot in London, a group of Puritan ministers had delivered to him what became known as the Millenary Petition, so named because it claimed to represent the wishes of 1,000 clergy. These ministers yearned for further reformation within the Church of England, pushing it farther from the vestiges of Catholic ceremony, fewer rituals, simpler worship, stricter moral discipline. They believed the man raised amid the sharp, uncompromising Calvinism of Scotland would be their ally. But they misjudged him. James had tasted the Presbyterian model in Scotland, where ministers debated him, lectured him, and sometimes condemned him directly from the pulpit. He had endured the Kirk's refusal to bow to a monarch in spiritual matters. And so, beneath his polite words, a conviction hardened. A king could not safely rule a church that had no bishops. Only a hierarchical church, ordered, structured, obedient, would ensure royal supremacy. Thus, James leaned not toward Puritanism, but toward a more Anglo-Catholic vision of the church, retaining its ceremonies, its episcopal leadership, its sense of ancient order. In the year 1604, seeking to address the petition yet maintain control, James convened the Hampton Court Conference. Puritan leaders and Anglican bishops gathered before him in a grand display of theological debate. James seized the opportunity to demonstrate his learning, lecturing, arguing, and quoting scripture with the pride of a man determined to assert his authority not only as king, but as a scholar. Most Puritan demands were dismissed with firm finality. But from the ashes of their disappointment, something profound emerged, a new translation of the Bible in English. If the church was to stand united, James reasoned, then its faithful needed a single, authoritative scripture. 54 learned translators were appointed. They labored through Hebrew, through Greek, through endless committees and revisions, and in the year 1611, the authorized version was completed, later known simply as the King James Bible. Its cadences would shape English speech for centuries, echoing through sermons, literature, and the whispered prayers of millions. It was James's greatest cultural legacy, even if he could not yet know it. But for the Puritans, Hampton Court marked the end of hope. They saw clearly now. The king would not reshape the church in their image. Some accepted defeat quietly, others seethed, and a few, those most disillusioned, left England altogether. By the year 1607, small separatist congregations fled to the Netherlands, seeking freedom from bishops and uniformity. There, too, life proved difficult. Eventually, a group made a bolder choice: to cross the ocean, to carve out a new world where their faith would be unchallenged. In the year 1620, these exiles, the Pilgrims, sailed to America aboard the Mayflower, beginning a chapter of history that neither James nor his council could have foreseen. Back in England, James felt content. He believed he had crafted a church stable enough to secure his reign, moderate enough to avoid war, loyal enough to uphold royal supremacy. He did not yet see what the future held, how the discontent bubbling beneath his careful structure would one day erupt, how Puritans and Catholics alike would continue to stir unrest during his time on the throne. For now, under the soft glow of his seemingly orderly church, the king rested. But beyond that calm surface, the religious storms of England were only gathering strength. At first, tensions with English Catholics seemed almost soothed. Many believers dared to hope that a king born to Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman whose own suffering had been entwined with Catholic identity, might show more gentleness than Elizabeth I had. But hope fades quickly in the realm of politics. When James made it unmistakably clear that he was a Protestant monarch, committed to preserving the Anglican Church and to maintaining royal supremacy within it, the mood shifted. Mild optimism within the Catholic community hardened into quiet bitterness. And among the more radical minds, something darker began to form. There had already been whispers of plots in the year 1603, each discovered before it grew teeth. Yet none of these compared to the boldness of the conspiracy that would soon emerge, one so shocking that its shadow would stretch across centuries. It was not merely a plan to kill the king. It was a plan to obliterate the entire English government in one explosion. The architect was Robert Catesby, a Catholic gentleman whose frustration had sharpened into despair. He gathered a circle of co-conspirators: Thomas Winter, Thomas Percy, John Wright, and eventually the man whose name would echo through history, Guy Fawkes. Fawkes had fought in the Low Countries, was skilled with gunpowder, disciplined and unwavering. If anyone could ignite a revolution in an instant, it was him. Their plan was terrifying in its simplicity. Parliament traditionally opened with the king, the prince, the lords, and the bishops all present under one roof. Destroy that roof and the entire Protestant leadership of England would vanish in a single burst of flame. The conspirators rented a house adjacent to the Parliament building, intending to dig a tunnel beneath it. But while exploring the cellars, they discovered something far more convenient. A spacious undercroft directly beneath the chamber where Parliament would meet. Quietly, over weeks and weeks, they hauled in 20 barrels of gunpowder, layering them with firewood and scrap iron to increase the blast's ferocity. If ignited, it would have shattered Westminster, killed hundreds, and plunged England into chaos. The plot crept dangerously close to completion, until human nature intervened. Some of the conspirators could not stomach the thought of Catholic nobles dying alongside Protestants. One, unable to endure the guilt, sent an anonymous warning to Lord Monteagle, urging him to avoid the opening of Parliament. Monteagle brought the letter to the authorities, and James, who had lived through assassination attempts, sudden coups, and blood-soaked Scottish politics, read it with a familiar chill. The cryptic phrasing, the veiled references. He recognized the language of conspiracy as one recognizes an old enemy. He ordered the cellars searched, but not immediately. He insisted the search be delayed until the night before Parliament met, so that if treason truly simmered below, it would have no time to escape. On the night of the 4th of November in the year 1605, soldiers swept through the undercroft by torchlight. There, guarding the hidden barrels, stood Guy Fawkes. He carried fuses, he carried matches, and he carried the grim composure of a man prepared to die for his cause. He was seized on the spot. The plot collapsed overnight. Catesby and several conspirators died in a gunfight as they fled. The others, including Fawkes, were dragged back to London, interrogated, tortured, and finally executed before a furious public. England erupted in both relief and rage, and in dark fascination with the daring audacity of the plan. From that moment, the 5th of November became a day carved into the national memory. Bonfires crackled, effigies burned. Children recited a rhyme that would outlive monarchs and empires. Remember, remember, the 5th of November, and Guy Fawkes, masked, defiant, ghost-like, became an emblem of rebellion in distant centuries, long after his body had turned to dust. For James, the gunpowder plot was more than an attempted assassination. It was a cold whisper in the dark, a reminder that the throne he held grand, heavy, draped in the union of two kingdoms, rested atop an invisible powder keg. Beneath the gilded surface of England lay religious fury, political resentment, and men convinced that violence was the only language left to speak. The blast never happened. But its echo followed James for the rest of his reign. After the gunpowder plot faded into history, James found himself confronted not by assassins or zealots, but by an adversary far more mundane and far more relentless: money. His court lived extravagantly. Ceremonies, gifts, jewels, hunting progressions across the countryside, generous titles for his favourites, every gesture drained the royal coffers a little further. By the second decade of his reign, the financial seams were beginning to strain. Robert Cecil, the architect of James's succession and the most capable statesman of the age, attempted to rescue the situation. He introduced reforms, examined revenue streams, and tried to tighten the monarchy's spending. But every adjustment brushed against the interests of England's powerful landowners and merchants. The more Cecil tried to modernise the system, the more resistance he encountered. England's fiscal machinery was still rooted in medieval forms of income wardships, feudal dues, monopolies, inefficient relics that angered the people yet were vital to the king's purse. In the year 1610, Cecil put forward an ambitious plan known as the Great Contract. Under this proposal, Parliament would grant the king a fixed annual sum, stabilising the crown's finances once and for all. In return, James would surrender several ancient feudal revenues that Parliament despised. On parchment, it was elegant, modern, balanced, and mutually beneficial, but idealism rarely survives contact with English politics. When the House of Commons submitted its list of grievances, the privileges they wanted abolished, The reforms they demanded the king felt cornered. He saw not cooperation but intrusion. And so, negotiations collapsed. The great contract died before it ever truly lived. Parliament dissolved. Cecil, exhausted and disheartened, declined rapidly and died in the year 1612, leaving James without his most competent minister. 2 years later, in the year 1614, James summoned a new parliament. If he hoped for improvement, he would be disappointed. The Commons quarrelled, splintered, and stalled. No subsidies passed. No legislation moved. It achieved so little that history baptized it with a bitter name, the Addled Parliament. After only a few months, James dismissed it in frustration, earning yet another mark against his reputation as a king unable or unwilling to work with the institution that England valued most. With finances tightening and public respect thinning, James sought refuge where he always had, in affection. Attention, warmth, admiration. These were balms he craved. And in the year 1607, the balm arrived in the form of Robert Carr. Carr was young, strikingly handsome, and Scottish, a combination James had always found irresistible. After Carr broke his leg during a tilting match, the king visited him, comforted him, lifted him from obscurity. Soon he was Viscount Rochester, then Earl of Somerset. He dined with the king, slept near the king, and guided whispers in the royal ear. To love James was to rise swiftly. To be loved by him was to ascend like a comet. But Carr's ascent carried shadows. He fell in love with Frances Howard, Countess of Essex, a woman already married to Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, whose father had once led a rebellion against Elizabeth. For Carr and Frances to wed, her marriage had to be annulled. James, besotted, helped her. The annulment was granted under dubious circumstances. And then the scandal deepened. Thomas Overbury, Carr's closest friend and advisor, opposed the marriage. Frances Howard despised him for it. Through court manoeuvring, Overbury was imprisoned in the Tower of London, supposedly for refusing a foreign assignment. There, mysteriously, he died. Whispers thickened. Rumours swirled. And finally, evidence emerged. Overbury had been poisoned. The blame pointed squarely at Frances Howard and Robert Carr. The lovers were arrested, tried, and condemned to death. The spectacle shook England. This was more than a crime. It was corruption blooming at the very centre of royal favour. But James could not bring himself to kill Carr. He commuted their sentences. They lived, though their reputations did not. Carr's influence evaporated. He drifted into the shadows, disgraced and discarded. And so the most intimate place beside the king, the place where politics and emotion blurred into one, fell vacant once again. It would not remain vacant for long. Into that opening stepped George Villiers, a young man of remarkable charm, elegance, and ambition. He would soon eclipse Carr entirely. He would become the king's constant companion, his solace, his power, his obsession. And in ways James could not yet foresee, George Villiers would lead the Stuart monarchy towards storms far greater than scandal or debt. George Villiers arrived at court like a flame in a draughty room, young, radiant, exquisitely poised. His beauty alone might have propelled him upward, but behind him stood those who despised Robert Carr and wished to unseat him. They shaped Villiers, polished him, and presented him as a remedy to a king's fading infatuation. And James, hungry for affection that was uncomplicated and adoring, fell quickly under his spell. Villiers' rise was astonishingly swift. He was knighted, then made Master of the Horse, then raised to Earl, then to Marquess, and finally, after only a handful of years, to Duke of Buckingham. Few men in English history had ever climbed so high, so quickly. Every new honour reflected not politics but intimacy. James adored him, and Buckingham, clever and magnetically ambitious, learned to wield that adoration like a sceptre. At first, Prince Charles, the heir to the throne, viewed Villiers with suspicion, even disgust. But proximity changes everything. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the prince and the favourite became close. Friendship bloomed, and soon a trio governed England. James, aging and weary, Buckingham, handsome and omnipresent, and Charles, thoughtful but increasingly restless beneath the weight of his future crown. No major decision moved without Buckingham's breath upon it. Meanwhile, In Scotland, James tried to impose the 5 Articles of Perth, demanding that the Scottish Kirk adopt more Anglican-like practices. It triggered quiet fury, a simmering resentment that would erupt more violently in the next reign. But the danger James faced at home was mild compared to the storm forming across continental Europe. When James's daughter Elizabeth married Frederick V of the Palatinate, it seemed a triumph of Protestant diplomacy. But when Frederick accepted the crown of Bohemia, a direct challenge to the Catholic Habsburgs, everything changed. Europe plunged into the 30 Years' War, a conflict that would scar the continent like an open wound. Elizabeth and Frederick ruled Bohemia for less than a single year. After the catastrophic defeat at White Mountain in the year 1620, they fled exiles, stripped of title and home. England wept for Elizabeth, calling her the Winter Queen, a symbol of how quickly glory can freeze and shatter. Many cried out for action, demanding James send armies to restore her lands and honour. But James hesitated. War was expensive. He knew how fragile his finances were. He also knew that his dream of a peaceful, united Christendom, nurtured through diplomacy rather than bloodshed, would die the moment England marched. And so, between reluctance and resolve, he remained suspended. England saw caution. James believed it was wisdom. This is where the Spanish match took root. If Charles married Maria Ana, the Spanish Infanta, perhaps Spain would help restore Elizabeth and Frederick without a single sword drawn. It was a beautiful idea. Gentle, elegant, almost idealistic. But Spain's demands were steep. Improved treatment of English Catholics, impossible concessions regarding worship, and the slow, grinding wait for papal approval. Negotiations dragged endlessly. Every year of delay was another year Elizabeth remained stateless. Charles and Buckingham grew impatient, deeply impatient, and so, in the year 1623, in an act of reckless romanticism, or perhaps political naivete, they travelled in disguise to Madrid. They imagined a fairy tale negotiation. Charles charming Maria Ana, Spain swept up in goodwill, a grand alliance blossoming through personal contact. But reality was far colder. The Spanish court was polite but distant. Conditions remained severe. Maria Ana showed no interest. And the dream that Charles had carried so fervently collapsed in front of him. Humiliated, Charles and Buckingham returned to England burning with indignation. Their personal disappointment hardened into public hostility. Spain was now the enemy not only diplomatically, but emotionally. Buckingham, once the architect of peace, demanded war. Charles echoed him. And James, old, sick, and exhausted, tried desperately to pull them back toward negotiation. He could not. By the time Parliament met in the year 1624, the mood of the nation had changed entirely. Anti-Spanish fervour filled the chamber. Buckingham and Charles, moving as a single political force, steered England toward breaking the Spanish match once and for all. James reluctantly agreed, recognizing he no longer had the strength to resist the tide. A new marriage was arranged instead. Prince Charles would wed Henrietta Maria of France. A French alliance replaced a Spanish dream. James watched all this unfold from the edges, his hands trembling so violently that he now used a stamp instead of signing documents. The reins of power were slipping from his fingers, passing quietly to his son and to his beloved Buckingham. And as the king faded into illness and age, the two young men at his side prepared to step into a future filled with noise, ambition, conflict, and, ultimately, blood. As we drift toward the end of James's long, winding journey, imagine the lights dimming, the noise of court politics softening, and the echo of distant horse hooves, fading into something like a memory rather than a sound. His life so full of storms, betrayals, fragile loyalties and brief bursts of warmth begins to settle, slowly, carefully, like dust floating downward after a long day. And if we let ourselves breathe a little deeper, we can almost feel the weight lifting, the story stretching out into something quieter, gentler, more reflective. James was never the invincible king he wanted the world to believe he was. He was the frightened child behind castle walls, the young man clinging to affection wherever he could find it, the ruler trapped between two kingdoms that demanded different things from him. His successes brought pride, and his mistakes brought consequences he could not outrun. Yet woven through all of it, every triumph, every misstep, there was always a longing for peace, a desire to hold together a world that seemed determined to fall apart at every seam. And perhaps that is the quiet truth this story leaves behind for us. That power does not erase fear, that crowns do not silence loneliness, and that even those who shape history often stumble through the dark, searching for gentleness, understanding, and a place where they can finally rest. James sought unity, even when he did not fully understand it. He sought stability, even when his own heart trembled. And he sought love, in all the complicated forms love can take, even when it cost him more than he expected. As the decades pass, as his reign slips deeper into the soft blur of the past, the sharp angles of conflict begin to round out. What remains is not the noise of parliament or the heat of scandal, but the quieter things, the way he dreamed of harmony, the way he believed words could mend fractures, the way he tried to hold the crowns of two kingdoms with a single pair of human, imperfect hands. So now, let those images fade. The crowded throne room, the flickering torches, the restless council chambers, let them melt into the background like distant lanterns on a foggy night. Let your shoulders loosen, let your breathing slow, and allow James's story, in all its complexity, to settle softly around you, not as a burden, but as a reminder that even in the most turbulent lives, there is always room for tenderness, for growth, for the hope of something gentler. And as you drift deeper into this quiet, I'll leave you with one final whisper. You are safe, you are calm, and the night is here to hold you. Wish you a truly peaceful night's sleep. And if you'd like to keep traveling with us through these soft, quiet, deeply soothing stories, the kind that make your heart feel warm and a little drowsy, then please subscribe to the channel so the next videos can find their way to you, gently, slowly, and at exactly the moment you need them. Wishing you a calm and restful night.